Okay, in our last segment, we covered steps 1 and 2 of the cognitive decision-making model. We're picking up now with step 3. So after the information search, we've got the evaluation of alternatives. And this is a two-stage process, you'll notice here. We're going to spend most of our time here on the second stage because it is more involved. So stage 1 is a non-compensatory process, and it is simply first narrowing down the choices by product category. For instance, let's say that you're thinking about getting a beverage. You've decided to buy a beverage. Hey, at this point, you might decide to only consider caffeinated beverages or just non-caffeinated beverages, right? Or let's say you were considering a snack. Some people might narrow that down to a low-calorie snack. Other people might narrow it down to just considering those that are energy-producing snacks. Okay? So the first stage, that non-compensatory process, is simply narrowing it down by product category. Stage 2 is more involved. This is a compensatory process. And this is the process of considering which brand within that category to purchase by evaluating the attributes. So a lot more involved here. Let's look at this process more carefully. Okay? First off, there are different types of attribute considerations. So attributes can address utilitarian needs and or hedonic needs. A utilitarian need is a need for a functional or practical benefit. So key word here kind of being functional need, right? But, we also have hedonic needs oftentimes, and that's more an experiential kind of category of needs. It might be that that involves the pleasure the product is going to give you, or the fantasy of that the product is going to offer for you, and other things that are not considered practical needs. So let's say for some people, aesthetic needs are really important. So besides the function of the product, they're also going to be concerned with how, for instance, it might look within their environment, an aesthetic need. For some products, there might be an excitement in owning it, or the image that it portrays, might be something that feeds a fantasy of yours. All right. I want to make sure that you can tell the difference between these. So I'm going to give you a little quiz here. I'm going to tell you about my dream car. I'm going to tell you about all the different attributes that I would like it to have and available, within that model. So you tell me whether each attribute is a utilitarian need or a hedonistic need. So I'm going to list these. What you might want to do is just write down a U or an H. Pause your video while you write that down, and then listen and find out if your answer was correct. I will give you the answer. All right, so my dream car would have really high gas mileage. Which one is that? Write it down. And if you wrote down a U, you are correct. That is a utilitarian need. I would like this car to be as small as possible for the ease of parking. Write it down. Is that U or H? And that is a U for that purpose, because I said the ease of parking, right? Now, if I had said, because I think small things are really cute, what would that have been? And if you wrote down H, you are correct. That would have been hedonic need. What about this? I would like the car to be pewter in color, the color pewter. Okay, which kind is that? And that is hedonic. I want my car to have a USB import. Okay, so a USB input available in the car would be a utilitarian need. And this is personal to me, but I really want my car to have an option of a heated steering wheel. okay? And that would be utilitarian, heated steering wheel. And then I would like a really modern model of that car, okay? I want it to look modern, to feel modern. What would that be? And that is hedonistic. And then finally, I want my car to have the option of GPS included, okay, built into the car. And that would be utilitarian. Okay, so customers can really vary on their attribute consideration, right? One customer could walk into a car dealership asking to see what they have that has Hemi VH or V8 engines, also with 6-speed transmissions, etc. Okay, the next person might come in and say, "I want a red one." Okay, you never know. Now, feature creep occurs when a brand has too many attributes. Like this pictured Microsoft Word program. Look at that, unbelievable. Makes you dizzy just looking at it. Now, don't get feature creep mixed up with the brand overload. Remember, brand overload is when there are too many brands that are being offered. This is when too many attributes are offered with a brand. Now, a really interesting study was done in the year 2000, and we're going to call it the JAM study. Notice the researchers' names are not included here on the slide. So, even though you take other notes beyond this, if I don't, that you need to for tests beyond what's on the slide, when it comes to researcher names, only if they're on the slide. So I'm going to tell you the researcher names and the year they did it, but you don't have to remember that. Sheena Engar and Mark Lepper did this really interesting study in the year of 2000. So we're going to call it the JAM study. If I test you on this, I will call it the JAM study. They offered participants 6 or 24 flavors of a brand of jam to sample for free. Those who had to choose from 24 flavors were 10 times less likely to buy than those who were offered 6. People want to see the features that they care about and that they'll actually use, but the rest are perceived as, well, at best, clutter, at the very worst, as scary and intimidating and demeaning. Feature creep tends to increase with age. So let's look at the case of treadmills. Treadmills are sold to all ages of adults, but the elderly, when they buy them, they tend to, if they're really trying to attract the elderly, okay, they have more simple appearing panels. The elderly tend to be drawn to machines that have more simple appearing panels. That doesn't mean all elderly, right? It just means most elderly, okay? So notice how Windows and Apple allow you to design your own homepage with the icons that you care about the most and use. And any more than that, you would just perceive as clutter, right? Now some new treadmills have screens allowing self-designed home pages. And this is really a good idea, especially when it comes to the elderly. Another really good idea is when the salesperson offers as a free service to set that home page up for you. Okay. And again, especially with the elderly, and that doesn't mean that all elderly people are not very computer efficient. Some really are, right? But not all of them are. They certainly haven't grown up with that background like we have. Hey, so that can be really a great selling point. Now, when we talk about attribute consideration in this third step of the model here, we have got to include this model. So let's take a look at this. Because it's interesting, I'm not going to touch you on this really. I didn't even list it on your study guide, but it's still interesting and it makes a lot of sense. So attribute consideration is a function of both perceived importance and perceived uniqueness. Okay? And I'm saying perceived because perceived to an individual, right? What they perceive as important, what they perceive as unique. So it relies on an individual's own perceptions. We're going to fill in this 2 by 2 here. So let's first look at this cell, right? This is low importance and low uniqueness to an individual. And so if there's an attribute they run across that's offered with a model that is not important to them and doesn't seem unique, you know, the attitude tends to be, who cares, right? So they don't tend to care about it. Now, if you look over into this cell, it's still low importance, but it's perceived to be unique, an attribute that's unique. Then the attitude tends to be more like, oh, that's nice. In other words, fine if it happens to come with it, but not important if not. Okay? Then we get to the high importance ones. So if we look at the cell, high importance, but low uniqueness, this is what we call defensive features. These are called defensive features. An example would be wanting that attribute just because let's say your neighbors tend to have it. Okay, so the attitude might be keeping up with the Joneses, defensive features. Okay. Now we get to this cell, we're looking at high importance to you personally and high uniqueness. Okay, and these are called determinant attributes. Okay, they are going to have what we call positioning advantage because they will have the most effects on your decision. So a positioning advantage. Now, one more thing I want to talk about in this third step of evaluating alternatives. And in the second stage of that step, where you're involved in the compensatory process of brand consideration by attributes, okay, is another thing that will affect your decision, and that is what is called a cluster frontier. And this is cool because it usually only exists in your head. Not always, but usually. Okay? But a cluster frontier is a hypothetical ideal brand that contains the very best combination of attributes that you have found so far across brands, but not one brand that carries them all, that offers all of them. So let's consider an example here because this is going to affect how long this stage lasts. How long you are involved in this evaluation of alternatives, different brands buy the alternatives that they offer. Okay, so let's say that I look at water heaters, and so far I found 2 that I am seriously considering. One of them holds 40 gallons, and it costs $400 a year to run. The second one holds 60 gallons, but it costs $600 a year to run. I am motivated to search further to see if my cluster frontier really exists, a hypothetical brand that contains the best combination of these previously found attributes. So in this case, before deciding between these 2, I am first motivated to see if I can find my cluster frontier, the brand that would hold, the hypothetical brand that would hold 60 gallons but only cost $400 per year to run. Okay, so we're ending up this lecture segment with step 3, and we're going to begin the next one with step 4.